Okay, so this weekend workshop, and I think it's might be our third one, but I guess the main takeaway here is that we're going to be working with really three different entities. Looks like two entities, but it's really three entities. And the three entities are going to be users, departments, and user departments. Okay, so that we have a many-to-many relationship where we have, let's start out with the simplistic relationship. We have departments and we have users, okay? And I could go in here and delete my departments. My app might have restarted here. Let's see. Heroku, I think your apps restart if you're not using them every couple of minutes here. I could actually delete everything here. I have no users and I have no departments. I could add a user here. Okay, excuse me, good point. No editing functionality. I could add a department. So we'll say, well, we have the IT department. Okay, and let's also say we have the HR department. Okay, and we have the executive department. Okay, so we've got three departments and we have no users. When we decide to add a user, we end up adding a user, and one of the things that we see when a user gets added is that the user doesn't have any departments. And there's a little bit of UI here that says that there's a total of 3 departments, and since this user doesn't have any departments, he's grayed out here. Okay? You also see a line through the departments that he doesn't have. When we decide to add a user to a department, that line goes away, and I think it was maybe hard to see here, but the guy's no longer gray. It's kind of light, but I actually see it better up here than on my screen. Okay, so if I decide to add all the departments and the user is basically in every department, I turn it yellow. Granted, not the best choice of colors, but that's kind of the functionality that you have here. It's an interesting problem, hits on a lot of different pieces. In terms of how it should be set up internally, we'll end up taking a look at it. But the functionality is, again, basically if I start, whacking off departments here, get rid of this IT department, you'll see that it ends up changing up here. And again, what's happening behind the scenes, you can imagine that when I end up going and loading the page, what ends up happening is I end up getting a list of departments and a list of users with their user departments. Okay? We'll do another example of many-to-many so you can see it again in terms of what we're sort of looking at here in terms of building this. And some of this is a little bit open to interpretation. There's probably going to be a little bit more HTML here than you've done in the past. So I ended up breaking this up so that we didn't have this huge monolithic index.html page, which conceivably you could have. So I broke this up into smaller pieces. Nothing really all that major here. You can see that on our form that's up there. We've got a form to add a department. We've got a form to add a user. We've got a departments list. And we've also got a user list, and I also broke out the user item because there's a little bit more functionality in there for the individual users, where internally you can sort of imagine that what you're doing is that for every user that you have, you're looping over all the departments, and you're finding out whether or not a user has that particular department, right? Because if the user doesn't have that department, you're going to set it up so that you have a line through on the button, okay? And also, you're going to set it up so that your action, when you end up clicking on that button, is different, okay? If the user doesn't have a department, okay, that particular department, when they click on the button, we're going to have a post to basically add that user to the department. If they already have that department, we're going to do a delete to delete the user from the department, what's going to be helpful is to start thinking in terms of RESTful routes, which we'll end up looking at in a second. But in terms of our routes themselves, this is kind of a good way to think about this. I mean, you could actually set this up so that you could test your routes out. And I wanted to do a little testing with this too. But you can actually test your routes out. Your routes aren't all that complicated. Your UI is going to get a little bit complicated, but your routes themselves are not going to be. When we end up looking at the routes, some of these are really no-brainers, right? When we have a route for, obviously we have our main route, which is showing this page, right, our slash route. Other than that, we're basically manipulating our data. We've got let's start out with the simple one. Let's start out with our departments. We can either create or delete a department. That's it. And that, we can build that with a demo in 5 minutes probably, maybe 10, okay? So that's a fairly simplistic route. We can do the same thing with a user. We can create a user by doing a post route, and you see that it's a post to slash, and the reason why it's a post to slash is that we'd be mounting those user routes on slash users, we'd be mounting those department routes on slash departments, okay? And again, we want to separate these things out so they're maintainable. What is a little bit more complicated is what happens when we want to delete not a user, but we're going to go to slash users, the ID of the user, user departments, and some ID. This would be the ID for the user department. Okay? We have, in our database, we're going to have 3 tables. Okay? We're going to have a table for users, we're going to have a table for departments, and we're going to have a table for user departments. Okay? So when we want to delete a user from a department, well, we have the ID for that user department, and the best way to do that RESTful route is to basically just say, hey, look in the user departments table and get rid of that ID. When we decide to post, so we're going to create a user department for a user, we're going to end up doing the post. We've got a user ID, we've got a user department, and when we do that post, we're going to have to specify what? Right? We're going to be adding a department for a user, so we're going to have some form value or something that gives the department ID that we want to add. Okay? We can end up doing that with a hidden field, but again, a RESTful route is going to specify that we're posting to user ID, user departments, and we're going to have some form value that specifies what department ID that is. Okay? And our end result is that we're going to be adding a record to the user department table. The delete is going to remove something from the user department table. A post is going to add something to the user department table. Those are the 2 sort of trickier routes. But again, you can get those routes working without worrying all that much about the UI. If we sort of go down from those routes to our database structure, and this is a structure that we've seen before, where within a DB folder, we have a DB file. That DB file is just going to be your new SQLize object. That's your entree into the database. That's your SQLize object. That's where your connection string is stored, and you end up exporting that because it's going to be used by these other files. We've got 3 models. We've got a user, and I'm putting in some instance methods here to make our life a little bit easier. We haven't used instance methods before. I'm going to show you what they are in another video. But instance methods allow us to take little model, so not the big user, but a little user. And if we have a user, and that user has a collection of user departments, what we want to be able to do is pass the departments in here and let it tell us, in fact, whether or not the user has all the departments. If we want to find out if the user has no departments, that's pretty easy. Just look at its user departments and tell us that there are no departments there. If we want to know if the user has a particular department, we can pass in a department. That department has an ID, and we could loop over that user's departments to see whether or not that user has a particular department. On the same token, this is kind of helpful because when we end up doing that delete route, if we know that the user has a department, well, we want to know what their user department ID is, okay? There are other ways we could have done this. When we wanted to go and delete a user from a department, we could have passed in the user ID and the department, okay? But I think a more restful way is to say, hey, look, there is an entity, there's an ID in that user department table. Use that ID, and that's what this will end up giving us. So we'll look at what those are. Maybe I'll put a little bit more explanation here as well. Most of the work, well, a lot of the work is going to be in the models here. Again, these instance methods you could probably get away without doing, but they're just going to make your life a lot easier. They're going to make the code more testable, and the logic is going to be isolated where the logic should be, which is going to be here in these instance methods. The department model is tiny. The user department model is tiny. We end up making our connections in the index.js file, and it's a really simple connection, just to say that a user has many user departments, that a user department belongs to a user. I'm not even sure you need all these relationships, but on the same token, a department has many user departments, okay? A user department also belongs to a department. We'll look at this relationship again with another model so you can end up seeing it, but that's pretty much what the relationship is. We're going to sync our database and seed some data. It's always nice to start out with something. I think in my example, I'm starting out with me and Mitch, and I think this ended up getting deleted, but again, you could end up starting out with some data. So again, the idea here is that I could add a user, and Mitch doesn't have any departments. I could give him a department, and if I give him both departments, right, this will end up happening. I think I'm also getting the users alphabetically. So if I add Alex, something we haven't looked at, Alex should end up showing up first, right? So these are all things that we can end up taking a look at. Again, there's going to be a fair amount of code in your HTML, but that might be sort of the last thing that I would end up focusing on. You can do some testing, right? We've done some testing before, so again, as long as you understand what the entities are and what the routes are, you really can build those routes out first. And if you have those routes built out, then you can focus on the front end. The other thing that I would say is just as a starting point, just to get sort of warmed up, don't even have the user department model. Just have a user model and a department model, and figure out how you can add a user and add a department. Keep them totally independent of each other. You can add a user, you'll see the user, you can delete a user, that user will be gone. You can add a department, okay, you'll see that department, you can end up deleting that department. Where there's no connection between those two objects. At a minimum, right, that would be sort of half of the CRUD. Well, that would be 3 out of 4 things, right? Looking at an entity, right, reading, creating, deleting. The only thing we're leaving out there is updating. Okay? Again, I figure if you could do those other 3, you could also end up updating as well. So it's an interesting challenge here. I think it's should keep you busy. Again, there's some logic that we put in here to sort of differentiate users based on how many departments that they end up having. There's all kinds of business logic that you could decide to add to this. You might decide that one of the departments is a default department, so that when you end up creating a new user, you automatically give that user entree into that department. That is something that maybe we could add as extra credit. But that, again, that gets to be a little bit more complicated because if you don't have, if you end up wiping out your default department, then your functionality will change. But there's all kinds of things you could do. Again, if you find this easy, I'll be very, very happy. And if you don't, that's fine. You'll work it through. And if you do find it easy, again, you could end up making it more complicated and building it out a little bit. So any questions about the assignment? No. If I delete the department, will they gray out? Yeah, it's a good question. Because in that case they actually have all and none.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, so I think it's I think basically I'm adding both classes. So yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. That's actually a great question. Yeah. Any other questions? Do people understand these routes? And again, I'll add some functionality to this. Again, it would not be totally clear to me by looking at this. I mean, one thing you could tell is, hey, look, if my goal is to create a user department, okay? And again, this is a real live way that people end up doing nested relationships, right? A user has many user departments. If I want to delete that user department, I give you the ID of that user department. If I want to create a new user department, I'm going to need a department ID, and that's going to come in the way of a form value. Okay? I could have put the department ID here, but this gets a little bit messy and is usually not the way that things end up getting done. So when you're posting something, you basically pass back the object that you need to post, and we have the user ID, we're passing back the department ID.
The deletes, the two deletes, right? The first one is, that's the department, the user department. Actually, the department, the user department.
This one is the user department, this one is for the user themselves. Mm-hmm. That would be this route. When I call delete for a user, that would be on the user route. Look, if you want to, look, you could always, I'll send you out this link. I don't want to do it now because someone will probably put in some profanity or something. But if I went over here and I went to delete this, and I look at my network tab, and I look over here, I could see that this was a post, but I'm using my method override for delete, okay? As opposed to when I add a user, this is going to be a post to users, all right? I'm sending some data here. When I go to add a user to a department, this is going to be a post to user departments where I'm passing the department ID. When I go to delete, so here's a good example. When I go to delete, HR, you'll see that this is a delete, and you'll see with the URL that those numbers start to get pretty high because those are my user department numbers, right? There's an ID for each department that a particular user has, right? In that row, you have a user ID and a department ID, and that's what you're sending back. Again, that's the real RESTful way to do it, right? You're actually deleting a particular entity for the user department. The other thing that I should also say here is that when you delete a user, you also want to make sure you end up deleting their user departments. Not that you'll end up seeing them again, but it probably just makes sense to clear that data out. And again, I'll give another example of many-to-many and also just a single relationship as well. This seem like a decent project for you? If this was similar to some other ones that I had done in the past, any questions?
I was just saying, the timeline
No. I think it would be a little. Look, I could do it. You know, if you really had to put time on it, time into it for a week. I think if I was just going to, like if it was just a 1 weekend project, I would start with a belongs to relationship. Something like another Twitter or WikiStack example. I think that would be doable. Here you have a little bit more time to do it, so I'm introducing this whole concept of many to many. My feeling is this: if you could get many to many, that means you understand belongs to and has many, and we're good. Really, I think that's what it ends up coming down to. Again, you might struggle a little bit with some of the swig templating things. It's not the best templating engine. I'm sort of kind of stuck with it. I could look at other templating engines, but in the end, we end up, we abandon server-side templating engines anyway when we end up moving to React. So it's like, why bother going through the hassle? It's not like I could say to you, hey, look, I use Jade at work, or I use Pug or Haml or something, because I don't, right? When you end up building single-page applications, which is what we're going to build, all our templating engines are going to be a lot better, and they're going to be done on the client side. Any other questions?
My brain just went into, didn't understand. You were saying that you're using React. You related something React to templating engines, and I didn't get that whole.
So in the end, you're not going to use in your application development when you get out of full stack. You're probably not going to use server-side templating engines. Okay, you're going to be using different templating engines, which are going to be a little bit easier to work with, and that's what you're going to end up learning. Good. All right, let me stop this recording.